Hello, welcome to my channel. This is Carla, and in this video I'll be showing you how I drape this basque waist corset that I'm doing for a client. To those of you who are not familiar with it, draping is a technique used by fashion designers to create patterns directly on a dress form, kind of like what I'm doing here, allowing for more organic and fluid designs. Personally, I'm not a sketcher. A lot of the times I actually create or I come up with designs through draping. Not to say that I don't sketch anymore, because I absolutely still do, but with Pinterest and Instagram and Facebook, 99.9% of the time nowadays, my clients come to me with photos, pictures, videos, or reels of designs that they've seen online, and then they would like for me to recreate, not necessarily recreate, but use as inspiration, and I usually go from there. And just to be very honest, my process actually changes every once in a while because it really comes down to who I'm working with. You know, it's a collaborative process, so it really depends on the amount of trust also that they have for me. So for this specific prom dress, my client and her mom sent me a few photos of designs that they found online and just gave me some notes, pointed out the design details that they would love for me to keep. For example, the basque waist, the tulle skirt, and the lace-up closure in the back. As far as color goes, they wanted it in a hue of both green and blue. And then for the rest, they kind of just left it up to me. So yeah. Anyway, the draping process. Before anything else, by the way, you're going to want to choose a mannequin closest to your client's size. Luckily for me, she's exactly the same size as this mannequin, so I didn't have to do a lot of modifications. And as far as style tape goes, I opt for a colored 1/4 inch paper masking tape. Any color will do really, so long as it's visible through your muslin. And with that style tape, I start placing my style lines and marking key points like my bust, my waist, or even my notches. So this is kind of like the time where I design and think about construction. I step back a few times to see if I like the design or if I don't. Sometimes I sleep on it. I think about how I'm gonna line it, if it makes sense, will it stay up? If I like the design, did I say that already? And for example, the bust area, I actually changed that 5 times because I really wanted to add a foam on there so she doesn't have to wear a bra. And I decided to just go for a monocup, which means I had to consider where to place my boning, etc., etc. By the way, very, very important, make mental note, or if you have to write it somewhere, as early as this stage to consider deciding which side of the style tape you'll be tracing, whether it's the top or the bottom or the left or the right. It honestly doesn't really matter which side you choose, really, so long as you stay consistent throughout your process, because remember that these style lines will become our seam lines. So it's important, just like puzzles, that they all meet at the end of the day. Fine. And so the draping begins. So you're going to want to start at the center front of the bodice. By the way, I apologize for skipping a step and not filming the process where I cut out that muslin piece that I'm working with. What it is basically just a muslin fabric that I cut into a piece large enough that will cover the areas of the dress form that I will be draping. So what I do is I measure the width and the height of that center front panel, because that's the panel I'm starting with, and I just add 2 inches all around. So for example, if this panel measures 4 by 6, I then add 4 inches to the width as well as the height, so then it will then be 8 by 10 inches. Again, it just has to be large enough to cover the areas of the panel that you will be draping. I then went ahead and added my grain line, which is going to be my center front line, and drew it 1 inch away from the right side of the fabric. And as you can see here, I start by placing that center front line along the center front seam of the dress form. The idea here is to mold the fabric around the dress form, and we just go one panel at a time, making sure that things are smooth, there's no puckering, no wrinkles whatsoever. You just want it to be as smooth as possible, because how it's gonna look when you're draping it is how it's gonna fit once the garment is sewn together. And at this point, I'm pretty satisfied with how it looks. And I'm sure you've noticed already that as I was smoothing things out, I was also pinning things in place. And I go ahead and transfer my style lines onto my muslin fabric. By the way, I apologize because I accidentally deleted the wrong video. As I was transferring my markers, I actually decided to use the inner part of the style tape, and clearly on this video I'm doing the exact opposite, so let's not do that. I actually redid this panel and traced the inner part of the style tape and traced the bottom part for the hem. Also, on top of the style lines, I make sure that I'm transferring notches, labeling things correctly. For this one, I put CF, center front. I also make sure I put an arrow, making sure that that's the right side up. As for the notches, I'm basically just using the twill tape that's already on the mannequin. If you can see that runs across the smallest part of the mannequin, and tracing the top part of that twill tape. Now moving on to the second front panel. I did the same thing as the first one, cut out a piece large enough to fit the area that I'm draping, added 2 inches all around, and drew the grain line to where I can place it right in the middle of that panel that I'm working on. Just like what we did in the front, we make sure that the grain line is perpendicular to the floor, parallel to the center front seam of the mannequin. And once again, I go ahead and smooth things out, pin where it's necessary, make sure that there's no puckering or wrinkling happening, as well as any tension, which you can see here that is happening on the upper part of this panel, which I will remedy by slashing or clipping at least 1/4 to 1/2 inch from the style lines, and that should release the tension. And this is precisely why I love draping so much, because if there's ever any fit issues or even a problem on the design itself, you immediately see it in the form of puckering, wrinkling, or tension. And that's honestly one of the things I love about it, because honestly, it's pretty humbling sometimes, because it's a sign that maybe your design's not working out, and that's okay, you know? So what do? We move on, we improvise and we keep going. If anything, we embrace it because it's part of the process, and it kind of makes everything extra exciting, in my opinion. And speaking of changes, as I'm sure you've noticed, I went ahead and traced both the upper and the bottom part of the underbust style tape, because there was some weird tension happening there. So I'm gonna decide later on whether or not I'm keeping or I'm using the bottom or the upper part of the style line. Other than that, I'm pretty happy with how it looks, so I went ahead and transferred all the markings before unpinning this piece, and we move on to the next panel. And just like what we did with the second panel, I went ahead and cut out a piece that is large enough to fit the panel that I'm working with. This one's a little bit larger than the second, but again, adding 2 inches all around, and then making sure I add my grain line. And speaking of grain line, that's actually what I do first and foremost, is make sure that that grain line is placed vertically perpendicular to the floor and parallel to the center front or the center back of the dress form, and then I work my way out. Meaning I start smoothing things out from that grain line and out to the outer part of the panel. I also try to make sure that I'm pinning either outside of that panel, outside of the style lines, or right at the style line, so I know which areas have the tension and if I need to clip or slash outside of the panel. And the thing is also, I rarely ever pin in the middle of each panel, because in reality, when my client is wearing this corset, for example, where I pin is where things are sewn together. The goal is to just let the fabric do what it wants to do and not force it to do something it doesn't want to do, if that makes sense. With that said, for your draping fabric, you're always going to want to use one that has very similar properties or features as the original fabric that you want to use. Otherwise, if you're just draping a really small piece like a corset or this bustier I'm working on, you can go ahead and go straight to your fabric. Unless of course that fabric's super expensive, then you're going to want to use a much cheaper one for your muslin. And now we're done with panel number 3. Again, I smoothed everything out, made sure I pinned wherever I needed to pin, and transferred all my markings and labeled it panel number 3. Now on to panel number 4. Again, making sure we are placing that grain line vertically perpendicular to the floor and parallel to the center front or the side seam at this point. Then we start draping the fabric onto the dress form, making sure that I slash or clip 1/4 to 1/2 inch away from the style lines to remove all the tension. And once I'm happy with my drape, I go ahead and transfer all my markings and make sure that I label this piece. As for the side seam, although I didn't bother tracing it with the style tape, I'm actually going to go ahead and transfer that because I will be using the original side seam. Now onto the bust. Again, I cut out a piece large enough to fit the panel that I'm working with, adding 2 inches all around, and then starting the drape at the center front, making sure I line up the grain line again with that center front seam of the dress form, and then smooth things out from there. And once I'm happy with it, I go ahead and transfer my markings and label this bust 1 or B1. By the way, for the bust seam, I'm actually tracing the outer side of the tape because for some reason, the outer bust, which will be our B2 that I will be draping later, can be a challenge because there's a lot of curve there. So what I usually do when I'm draping the inner bust, especially because I move the style line or the princess line and I'm not using the one that's already on the mannequin, I still drape it starting from the center front line and then smooth it out from there. But when I get to the princess seam, I actually originally planned on trying my best to reach the farthest end of the style tape. Also because I wasn't planning for the princess seams to match, so this is totally fine. And that curve on the bust just gets a little bit challenging, and my goal was to not need a dart on my outer bust. But we'll see. We're gonna find out together. And believe it or not, I may be doing this for 17 years, but the bust section sometimes can really be such a mission. Anyway, onto the outer bust panel. And you're probably noticing I'm using such a large piece of muslin fabric, but if you're a beginner and new to draping, I highly suggest just cutting a piece large enough to fit the panel you're working on. I feel like it makes draping a little easier and less confusing. But obviously with experience, you guys will probably come up with a more efficient and sustainable way of doing this. Anyway, back to the bust. Like what I said, it can be challenging, but I am doing the same exact thing as before. I drew my grain line and making sure that is placed vertically perpendicular to the floor, and then just smoothing things out from there. And yes, I did my best to try to avoid that bust dart, but here we are. We are adding a bust dart on this side bust panel, and that's just how it's gonna be. We're just gonna accept it and embrace it. And once I'm satisfied with it, and go ahead and transfer all the markings. And at this point, I've actually decided to just trace the bottom part of that underbust style tape. So yes, we're gonna be tracing only the bottom and not the top. And I believe this is our last piece as far as the front bodice goes. Now we can move on to the back. Yay! So I basically did the same thing, prepping the fabric. I cut out a piece big enough to fit the panel that I'm working on. And then I added the grain line, which is about 1/2 inch from, this time, the left side of the fabric edge or the selvage. And similar to what we did to the center front panel, we are also lining up that grain line along the center back seam and pinning it in place. Then we can go ahead and smooth everything out, starting from the center back out to that outer seam. And just like I mentioned, I am tracing the upper part of the neckline and the inner part of the style line for anything that's placed vertically. And when I'm happy with the drape, I go ahead and double check that I did transfer all the markings and notches. And then I start to unpin. By the way, the back of this dress or the bustier is going to be a lace up. So I probably most likely won't be needing the first 2 panels of that center back because I need that space to lace it up. However, since I'm already here, I decided to just go ahead and trace it. It's just for me so I can keep the pattern in case I want to use it in the future. And like always, once I'm happy with it, I go ahead and make sure I transfer all the marking and label it and move on to the next panel. At this point, I feel like you know the drill. Make sure you have that grain line on there. You can either use your center back as your reference, make sure that's parallel with that, or your side seam. And this panel is looking pretty good so far, so I'm going to go ahead and transfer my style lines and my notches before unpinning and moving on to my last panel. Yay, we're on our last piece! Ugh, I can't wait to start sewing. Anyway, since my side seam is right there, I'm going to go ahead and use that as my reference and make sure that my grain line is placed parallel to that. Luckily, this section is pretty flat, so I had no issues draping this. And once I'm happy with it, just like the other pieces, I go ahead and transfer my markings and label the piece. Okay, I lied. I actually don't want to use the same pattern for my lining, so I'm going to go ahead and drape that after this. Ha! And you're probably wondering why not just use the same exact pattern. It's because there's just too many pieces. Just the front alone has 12 pattern pieces. So at the moment you're just seeing 6. You have 4 for the bodice and then 2 for the bust. And that's only half of the bustier. Obviously everything will be mirrored, which means just for the front alone, we're gonna have 12 pieces and then 8 for the back. And that is a lot of sewing, my friends. Again, this is a rush order, so I'm trying to be more efficient with my time. So for the lining, I'm gonna use the same exact patterns for the bust, but for the bottom part of the bodice, I'm gonna go ahead and drape just one whole piece and do the same for the back. The draping process is pretty much the same as all the other panels that we did. I went ahead and cut out a muslin fabric large enough to fit the area that I'm draping. Again, added 2 inches all around, drew my grain line, make sure we line that up with the center front seam of the mannequin. Ensure that there are no tension or puckering happening anywhere. And once I'm happy with it, I go ahead and transfer all my markings. Make sure I label my piece and then I unpin. By the way, I don't necessarily need to transfer all those seam lines. I'm just doing it for future reference. And of course, the same rule applies for the back bodice. I cut a piece large enough to fit the whole entire back, drew my grain line, make sure I pin that along the center back seam of the mannequin, and smooth things out starting from the center back of the panel. And because the back closure for this bustier will be a lace-up, we actually need an ample amount of space on the center back. So I'm actually really only going to be using the 2 side back pieces. But again, for future reference, I'm going to go ahead and drape the whole entire thing and then just cut what's necessary later on. And just like the front, I'm actually also going to be tracing all those seam lines for future reference. Because duh, I might get an order of this dress. That way I don't have to do this all over again, you know? Or you guys want a digital pattern of this bustier, I can do that too, of course. So yeah, once I'm happy with the drape, I go ahead and transfer all the markings, make sure I label everything. Now we have all our drapes. We're gonna go ahead and lay everything flat on a table. By the way, I apologize for the awkward angle of this video. I just couldn't find the screw that's supposed to attach my camera onto my overhead tripod. Anyway, now that we have our blocks on a flat table, I am now going to start truing them. Truing is the process of using rulers and design curves to correct a draped or drafted pattern to make sure that adjoining seam lines are matching and that curves are smooth, dart legs are equal length, and then lines that are supposed to be straight are actually straight or parallel or perpendicular. I also like to focus on the front pieces first, and I start with the first panel, which is our center front panel, and work my way out to the farthest panel from the center front, which should be the panel with the side seam. So right now I am currently comparing panel number 2 against panel number 1. I'm just making sure that the stitching line on the two pattern pieces that's going to be sewn together are the same exact length. Because the ultimate goal here is to make sure that the patterns are flowing smoothly into the next. And once I'm done, I go ahead and do the same exact thing to the third panel. Compare that to the second panel, make sure that the stitch lines are matching and that it flows smoothly. By the way, full disclosure, you don't usually do this on your drapings. Most of the time, you transfer your drapings first onto pattern paper and then true them. But like I said, this is a rush order, and so I gotta do what I gotta do. But I've draped with this fabric countless times, so we should be okay. Oh, and usually when I work on the back pieces, I always start from the center back and then out to the farthest piece, kind of like what I did with the front. But I guess today we're gonna keep going. I went ahead and grabbed the side back panel and matched that with the side front panel and made sure the sew lines are matching, cutting out any excess fabric. And I'm pretty much just repeating the process until I reach the farthest panel of the bodice. Excuse my dog. There is currently another dog in the house and she is jealous AF. Anyway, as I was saying, I'm pretty much repeating this process until I reach the center back panel, making sure all the sew lines are matching and then the patterns are flowing smoothly into the next. And once I'm done, I go ahead and add my seam allowance, which is 1/2 inch on all of my drapings. I also like to double, sometimes triple check my work. So as I'm adding the seam allowance, I'm also double checking the seam lines and the sew lines, making sure that everything still matches, especially after adding that 1/2 inch seam allowance. And once I'm done, I go ahead and cut out all the excess material. I then go ahead and repeat the same exact process to my lining pieces. Now on to cutting my real fabric. Yay! So I'm actually using the same exact fabric for myself and my lining. So I go ahead and cut the lining first. Again, everything is cut twice. Except for the front bodice, I decided that I don't want that center front seam. And here are all the pieces, both lining and the self. As for the bust, I'm doing a mono cup and we'll be adding an extra layer of fabric foam. So I went ahead and cut 2 of the side bust and 1 of the center bust. And that would be all for today's video. I'll upload the rest of the draping and sewing process next week. Please don't forget to subscribe. Thanks, okay, bye!